Good afternoon. I'm Scott Turner. I'm the Community Affairs Officer from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and I have the great pleasure of welcoming you all here this afternoon to hear about David Erickson's latest work, The Housing Policy Revolution, Networks and Neighborhoods. First, I want to thank everyone for coming here on a Friday afternoon. I know that's hard, and I also want to apologize for having it on the cusp of Yom Kippur, although I suspect that's the reason the room was available this afternoon. I also want to give my sincere thanks to the Board of Governors for hosting this event. We collaborate with them a lot, and in fact, we've hosted events with them in this very room. But it was extremely gracious of them to invite us to have this event here this afternoon, and I really want to thank them. You all have the agenda. We're going to have David speak first for 25 minutes, and then we have a distinguished panel of 4 experts who are going to come up right away and take their seats and immediately follow him with 5 to 8 minutes of reactions and comments about his book. Then the panel will stay there. David will jump back up, and we'll have a Q&A session and engage both with David and the audience. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce the panelists now, so we won't interrupt the flow. We'll just have them come up and start right away after David finishes. But the first panelist is going to be Brad Hunt, who is Associate Dean and Assistant Professor of Social Sciences at Roosevelt University in Chicago. And Brad's most recent work is a history of the Chicago Housing Authority called Blueprint for Disaster. Brad will be followed by Ellen Seidman, who's Senior Fellow and Financial Services Policy Director at the New America Foundation. Ellen's a frequent collaborator of ours and is also EVP at Shore Bank in her spare time. Ellen will be followed by Robert Pullman, who's Executive Director of the Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development, which is a group based here in DC of 125 nonprofits who I assume operated in the vast network that David describes so eloquently in his book. And then finally, we'll hear from Alan Bruby, who is Senior Fellow and Research Director for the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program. Alan's a good friend of ours and actually collaborated with all 12 Reserve Banks on an opus on concentrated poverty in America that took several years longer, I think, than he had ever expected. So he deserves some sort of reward for that. Now for the fun part, introducing David. So I first met David 4.5 years ago when I was filling the second of 2 PhD positions I was given to build a research function in my department. Now, those of you who know the Fed know that really in the Fed there's only one academic discipline, economics. And I'd already hired one PhD who has her PhD in human geography, which was already pushing the envelope. So in walks David, and I'm looking at his resume. He has substantial experience in deal making and affordable housing. He had master's in public policy from my alma mater, so of course I like that. Then I look, he has a PhD in history, and I thought, what the heck is the Fed going to think of that? But needless to say, he won us over quickly, and even more quickly proved himself an invaluable asset, not only to our bank, but to the whole Federal Reserve System. And he did that by first creating and launching a brand new journal, the Community Development Investment Review. He did that by establishing a new working paper series that gives voice to policymakers and academics and practitioners and does what he likes to say he does, which is bring ideas to people who get things done. And he's done that by overseeing a number of initiatives that exploring secondary market access for community development assets, to delving into peer-to-peer lending platforms to increase capital, to most recently commissioning a working paper and having an event right here in this room a few months ago exploring the crisis in community development finance. And somehow in the middle of all that, he wrote a book. So I'll leave it to David himself and to the panelists to really explore the book. But suffice to say, we think it not only adds considerably to the literature on affordable housing, but just as importantly, and on a personal level, we think it really gives a blueprint to those of us in community affairs in the Federal Reserve System in terms of trying to help build those local coalitions and networks that David talks about, and ultimately trying to address the challenges facing our disadvantaged communities. I should also mention the book's for sale over there in the corner by the Urban Institute Press, and I'm sure David would sign a copy if you bought one. But with no further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague and my good friend, David Erickson.
I've been working on this book for a long time, maybe 8 years in total. It started off as my dissertation at Berkeley, but at key points in time over the last 4 years while I've been working for Scott, I needed time to sort of to work on the book, and we still had all the deadlines and all the things that we normally have to get done. And Scott was so gracious to sort of give me the latitude to work on that I really couldn't have finished the book without his help. So I wanted to thank him publicly for that. And I want to thank Scott thanked the board, but I really want to thank John Moon and Shalise Fryer who helped organize the nuts and bolts of this event, and I really do appreciate that. I also want to thank the Urban Institute Press for taking a chance on me. I was first writer out of the box, and so that was very exciting for them to sort of think that this was worthy of such an important press house. And lastly, I'd like to thank my husband, Doug, who's here, and I'm happy that he's here for a couple of reasons. One, that I can thank him publicly, but two, he's been helping me with this project over the last 8 years and consistently has done a better job describing it to people. So if I don't do a good job explaining it to you, well, I'll direct your questions to him after the end. So what I'd like to do is just sort of give you sort of an overview of the book, tell you a little bit why I think it's important and how it fits into, I think, a larger story. But basically, the book just focuses on, and can you hear me all right? Is this, okay. 3 policy periods that I really focus on are the 1960s, what I call the rise and fall of the bureaucracies and affordable housing and urban development. A period that follows that's a sort of this period of real federal, I guess you'd call it federal inaction, that is a kind of there's a sort of surprising aspect to that second period because you had an explosion, a sort of revolution from below of local groups sort of taking matters into their own hands and doing things to build affordable housing and try to revitalize certain areas of their communities. And then sort of end with a third period where you see a combining of those local efforts with federal funding mechanisms that sort of build those local efforts up to scale. And so that's really sort of the arc of the book. I talk a little about some case studies. I'll go over a couple of those towards the end of the presentation. And then I have some policy recommendations at the very end. But one of the other things that motivated me to write this book, and it's part because this came out of the work I had done at Berkeley in the history department there, which is if you went to a library and you pulled off a book off the library shelf and on U.S. history, a textbook there, and said, okay, I want to see what's the sort of history of welfare state history in the 20th century in the United States, or the history of programs for low-income people in the 20th century. What you would read is that in the 1930s there was an explosion on the scene with the New Deal. Another explosion on the scene in the 1960s with the Great Society and the War on Poverty that is followed by a political backlash that puts that effort on the defensive, that was accompanied by a rise in conservative ideology and a rollback of the welfare state. If you were to sort of if you were to pull out a companion volume there just on affordable housing history, what you'd read is that we would follow that arc pretty closely. You'd see public housing kind of coming on the scene in the 1930s. In the 1960s, you get new programs like the 221d3 program or the Section 8 program, the creation of HUD in 1965, followed again by this period of inaction where the federal government sort of retreats. And I guess my response to that, and this is something, I'll only read this 2 sentences from the book. That would get, someone was teasing me that I would do some kind of Finnegan's Wake reading of the whole thing. But, the problem with that story is that you might have trouble hearing it over the din of construction of more than 2 million federally subsidized apartments for low-income tenants built between 1986 and 2006. These units were built by for-profit and non-profit housing developers and funded largely with tax credits and federal block grants. And this is a story that I feel is just not that well understood. And that's part of why I wanted to get this story out into the debate.